The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as Sergeant William Hayes adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he believed would be the last time. After 23 years of faithful service to the Crown, today marked his final day as a member of the Queen's Guard. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he fastened the brass buttons of his red tunic, each one polished to perfection despite the emotional turmoil brewing inside his chest. William had made the difficult decision to resign from his position 3 months earlier, following a series of personal tragedies that had shaken his faith in everything he once held dear. His wife Sarah had passed away after a long battle with cancer, leaving him alone to raise their teenage daughter Emma. The mounting medical bills and the emotional strain of watching his beloved partner fade away had taken its toll on his mental health and financial stability. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was leaving a job he had dreamed of since childhood. Growing up in a modest flat in Birmingham, William had watched the changing of the guard on television countless times, mesmerized by the precision and dignity of the ceremony. He had enlisted in the army at 18, with the sole purpose of one day joining the elite ranks of the Queen's Guard. Now, at 41, he was walking away from it all. As William made his way through the castle corridors, he passed portraits of monarchs who had ruled for centuries, their painted eyes seeming to follow his movement. The weight of tradition pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He thought about the thousands of tourists who would gather outside the gates today, cameras ready to capture the spectacle of the guard change, completely unaware that one of the participants was experiencing the most difficult day of his life. The other guards had already taken their positions when William arrived at the assembly point. His colleagues offered respectful nods and quiet words of encouragement, but there was an underlying sadness in their eyes. William had been well liked among his peers, known for his dry sense of humor and unwavering dedication to duty. Many of them understood his decision but couldn't help feeling that the Guard was losing one of its finest members. Captain Morrison approached William with a formal expression that barely concealed his personal disappointment. The two men had served together for over a decade, and Morrison had watched William transform from an eager young soldier into a seasoned professional who could be trusted with the most sensitive assignments. "Hayes," Morrison said quietly, "I want you to know that your service has been exemplary. The door will always be open should you change your mind." William nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, sir. It's been an honor." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing through the corridor. A small entourage was approaching, led by a nanny and flanked by 2 protection officers. In the center of the group walked a young boy with sandy brown hair and bright, curious eyes. Prince George, at 10 years old, carried himself with the natural poise that came from being born into royalty. Yet there was something unmistakably childlike about his wonder at the world around him. The prince was making one of his regular visits to the castle, something that had become more frequent as his parents worked to give him a deeper understanding of his future role. Today's visit was particularly significant, as it coincided with several important ceremonial duties, including the guard change that William was about to participate in for the final time. As the royal group passed by the assembled guards, Prince George's eyes moved from one red-uniformed figure to another, taking in the details of their appearance with the fascination that only a child could possess. His gaze lingered on William, perhaps sensing something different about the older man's demeanor. There was a gravity to William's expression that stood out among the stoic faces of his colleagues. The prince had always been drawn to the guards during his visits. Unlike many adults in his life who treated him with careful formality, the guards represented something authentic and grounded. They were protectors, defenders of tradition, men who had dedicated their lives to service without seeking recognition or glory. In their silent strength, Prince George found a sense of security that extended beyond their official duties. William noticed the boy's attention and felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with melancholy. Throughout his career, he had stood guard during countless royal events, always maintaining the required distance and professionalism. But there had been moments, brief glimpses, when he had witnessed the human side of the royal family. He had seen their joys and sorrows, their private moments of laughter and tears, always from the respectful distance that his position required. The entourage moved on, but something about the brief encounter lingered in William's mind. Perhaps it was the timing, or perhaps it was his heightened emotional state. but he found himself thinking about the weight of responsibility that rested on such young shoulders. Prince George was just a child, yet he was already being prepared for a life of duty and service that would span decades. As the morning progressed, William went through his duties with mechanical precision. He had performed these tasks so many times that his body moved through the motions without conscious thought, allowing his mind to wander through memories of his years in service. He remembered his first day on duty, the nervous excitement of standing guard outside Buckingham Palace. He recalled the pride in his mother's eyes when she saw him in uniform, and the way his father had straightened his own shoulders with military pride. The weight of his decision pressed down on him more heavily as the day wore on. Financial necessity had driven him to this point, but that didn't make it any easier. He had accepted a position with a private security firm that would pay significantly more than his military salary, enough to secure his daughter's future and pay off the debts that had accumulated during his wife's illness. It was the practical choice, the responsible choice, but it felt like betrayal nonetheless. During a brief break between duties, William found himself standing alone in one of the castle's quieter corridors, looking out through a tall window at the gardens beyond. The autumn leaves were beginning to turn, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of the changing seasons of his own life. He was entering a new chapter, one that felt uncertain and unfamiliar after more than 2 decades of military structure and purpose. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. William straightened automatically, expecting to see one of his fellow guards or a member of the castle staff. Instead, he was surprised to find Prince George walking toward him, accompanied only by his nanny, who seemed to be allowing the boy some degree of independence in the familiar surroundings of the castle. The prince approached with the confidence that came naturally to him, but there was something thoughtful in his expression that suggested he had something specific on his mind. William felt a moment of uncertainty about the proper protocol for this unexpected encounter, but his training kicked in, and he stood at attention. "You're one of the guards," Prince George said, his voice carrying the clear diction that had been carefully cultivated through years of education and training. "Yes, Your Highness," William replied formally, though he couldn't help but notice the genuine interest in the boy's eyes. Prince George studied William's face for a moment, his young features serious beyond his years. "You look sad," he said with the directness that children possessed before they learned to hide their observations behind social conventions. The simple statement caught William off guard. He had prided himself on maintaining his composure throughout this difficult day, but apparently his emotional state was more transparent than he had realized. He struggled to find an appropriate response that would be both honest and suitable for a conversation with a member of the royal family. "Today is a significant day for me, Your Highness," William said carefully, choosing his words with deliberate precision. The prince tilted his head slightly, a gesture that reminded William of his own daughter when she was puzzling through a complex problem. "Are you leaving?" Prince George asked, displaying an intuition that was remarkable for his age. William felt his composure waver slightly. "Yes, Your Highness. Today is my last day of service." The admission hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than William had expected. He had prepared himself for the formal ceremonies and official farewells, but this impromptu conversation with a 10-year-old prince was touching something deeper and more personal than he had anticipated. Prince George absorbed this information with the seriousness that had been instilled in him from birth. Even at his young age, he understood that people entered and left service to his family. But there was something about this particular moment that seemed to resonate with him on a level beyond his years. "Have you been a guard for a long time?" the prince asked, his curiosity evident in his tone. 23 years, Your Highness," William replied. And as he spoke the words, he felt the full weight of those decades settling on his shoulders like a mantle of memory and responsibility. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Prince George asking thoughtful questions about William's service and displaying a genuine interest in the man behind the uniform. Throughout their exchange, William found himself struck by the prince's maturity and the way he seemed to intuitively understand the significance of the moment without needing to have it explained in detail. As their conversation drew to a close, William realized that this unexpected encounter had given him something he hadn't known he needed: a sense of closure and validation that his years of service had mattered. In the eyes of this young prince, he could see respect and appreciation that went beyond mere protocol or courtesy. When Prince George finally continued on his way, William remained standing by the window, feeling as though something fundamental had shifted inside him. The conversation had lasted only a few minutes, but it had reminded him of why he had chosen this path in the first place, and why his years of service had been meaningful, regardless of how they were ending. The remainder of the morning passed more quickly than William had expected. As he went about his final duties, he found that his steps felt lighter and his movements more purposeful. The weight of sadness that had been pressing down on him all day had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something more manageable. Something that felt less like defeat and more like natural transition. When the time came for the ceremonial changing of the guard, William took his position with renewed dignity. The tourists gathered outside the gates, their cameras clicking away as the ceremony began with its time-honored precision. But for William, the presence of those observers faded into insignificance. This moment was about something larger than spectacle or tradition. It was about the completion of a chapter in his life that had been defined by honor, duty, and service. As he stood at attention, William caught sight of Prince George watching from one of the castle windows. The boy was too far away for their eyes to meet, but somehow William felt a connection across that distance, a sense that his final moments in uniform were being witnessed and acknowledged by someone who truly understood their significance. The ceremony concluded with its usual pageantry, but for William, the real ending had come earlier. In those few minutes of honest conversation with a young prince who had seen past the uniform to the man beneath. As he prepared to remove his red tunic for the final time, William realized that his years of service were ending not with bitterness or regret, but with a sense of completion that he had not expected to find. The day that had begun with such heaviness was concluding with something that felt remarkably close to peace. And while William could not have known it at the time, his brief encounter with Prince George had planted the seed for something that would grow into one of the most meaningful gestures of his life. A gesture that would ultimately demonstrate that even the smallest acts of humanity could have profound and lasting impact. 3 weeks had passed since William Hayes had walked out of Windsor Castle for the final time as a member of the Queen's Guard. The transition to civilian life had been more jarring than he had anticipated. Without the structure and routine that had defined his adult life, he found himself struggling to establish a new rhythm. The private security job he had taken paid well, but it lacked the sense of purpose and honor that had made his military service meaningful. William's days now consisted of monitoring corporate offices and occasionally providing protection for wealthy business people who wanted the prestige of having a former royal guard in their employ. The work was easy enough, but it felt hollow compared to the weight of responsibility he had carried during his years at the palace. His new colleagues were professional and competent, but they lacked the deep bond of brotherhood that had existed among the Queen's Guard. In the quiet moments between assignments, William often found his thoughts drifting back to his brief conversation with Prince George. There had been something profound about that encounter, something that had touched him more deeply than all the formal ceremonies and official recognition he had received over the years. The genuine interest in the young prince's eyes and the sincerity of his questions had reminded William of why he had chosen a life of service in the first place. Meanwhile, within the walls of Windsor Castle, Prince George was experiencing his own period of adjustment. The autumn term at his school had begun, bringing with it new challenges and responsibilities. His schedule was carefully managed, balancing academic studies with the increasing number of royal duties that were being gradually introduced to prepare him for his future role. Despite the busy routine, Prince George found his thoughts returning frequently to his encounter with the departing guard. There had been something about the man's quiet dignity and obvious sadness that had stayed with him. The prince had witnessed many formal farewells and ceremonial endings during his young life, but this had felt different, more personal, and immediate. During his regular visits to the castle, Prince George began to pay closer attention to the guards on duty. He noticed the subtle differences in their bearing and demeanor, the way each man brought his own personality to the role despite the uniformity of their appearance. The conversation with William had opened his eyes to the fact that each guard was an individual with his own story, his own reasons for service, and his own personal struggles. One evening, as Prince George sat with his tutor reviewing the day's lessons, he found himself unable to concentrate on the material before him. His mind kept wandering to thoughts of duty and service, concepts that had been abstract to him until his encounter with the departing guard. He realized that while he had been taught about the importance of his future role, he had never really considered the personal cost that service could exact on individuals. "Sir," Prince George said, interrupting his tutor's explanation of parliamentary procedure, "what happens to the people who work for our family when they can no longer continue in their positions?" His tutor, a learned gentleman named Professor Davidson, who had been carefully selected for his ability to nurture the prince's intellectual development, paused and considered the question. It was unusual for Prince George to interrupt his studies with such a personal inquiry, and Professor Davidson sensed that there was something specific prompting this curiosity. "Well, Your Highness," Professor Davidson replied thoughtfully, "it depends on the circumstances of their departure. Those who retire after long service often receive pensions and recognition for their contributions. Others who leave for personal reasons receive assistance in finding new employment when possible." Prince George absorbed this information, but it didn't fully address what he was really wondering about. Do they ever struggle after they leave? Financially, I mean, or in other ways? The professor studied his young charge's face, noting the unusual seriousness in his expression. "Sometimes they do, Your Highness. Transitioning from a life of service can be challenging, particularly for those who have dedicated many years to their roles." That night, Prince George lay in his bed thinking about the implications of what he had learned. The idea that people could sacrifice years of their lives in service to his family and then face difficulties afterward troubled him deeply. It seemed fundamentally unfair that those who had given so much should be left to struggle on their own when their circumstances changed. Over the next few days, Prince George began to formulate an idea. It started as a simple thought, almost childlike in its innocence, but it grew into something more sophisticated as he considered the practical implications. He wanted to do something meaningful for the guard he had met, something that would demonstrate his appreciation for the man's years of service and acknowledge the personal sacrifice he was making. The challenge lay in finding a way to act on his impulse without overstepping the boundaries of protocol and propriety that governed his every action. Prince George understood, even at his young age, that his position came with both privileges and constraints. Any gesture he made would need to be carefully considered and appropriately executed. His opportunity came during a conversation with his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, during one of their regular private meetings. These sessions had become increasingly important as the Queen worked to prepare her great-grandson for his eventual role, sharing wisdom gained from decades of experience and helping him understand the nuances of royal responsibility. "Granny," Prince George said as they sat together in one of the Queen's private sitting rooms, "I've been thinking about the people who serve our family." The Queen, who had always encouraged her great-grandson to think deeply about the implications of his position, smiled and nodded for him to continue. "I met one of the guards recently who was leaving after many years of service," Prince George explained. "He seemed sad about it, and I wondered if there was something we could do to show our appreciation for people like him." Queen Elizabeth studied her great-grandson's earnest expression, recognizing in his words the beginning of the kind of thoughtful leadership that would serve him well in the future. She had always been impressed by George's ability to see beyond the pageantry and ceremony of royal life to the human elements underneath. "What did you have in mind, George?" she asked, genuinely curious about his thoughts. Prince George had been thinking about this question for days, and he had developed what he believed was a reasonable proposal. "I thought perhaps we could write letters to people when they leave, thanking them personally for their service. Not just formal certificates, but real letters that acknowledge what they've given up for us." The Queen considered this suggestion carefully. It was a thoughtful idea, one that demonstrated George's growing understanding of the personal relationships that underpinned the monarchy's relationship with those who served it. However, she also recognized the practical challenges such a gesture might present. "It's a beautiful sentiment, George," she said carefully. "But you must understand that there are many people who serve our family in various capacities. Writing personal letters to everyone might not be practical." Prince George had anticipated this objection and had already thought of a response. "What if we started with just the guards? They're the ones we see most often, and their service is so visible and important. Maybe we could write letters to those who are leaving for personal reasons, not just those who are retiring normally. The Queen was struck by the sophistication of her great-grandson's thinking. He had identified a specific group and set parameters that would make the gesture both meaningful and manageable. More importantly, he had recognized the distinction between those leaving by choice at the end of successful careers and those forced to leave by circumstances beyond their control. "That's a very thoughtful approach, George," she said with genuine admiration. "How would you propose to learn about these situations?" Prince George had been considering this question as well. "Captain Morrison could help us identify the cases where someone might benefit from such a gesture. He knows all the guards personally and understands their circumstances." The Queen smiled at her great-grandson's thoroughness. He had not only conceived of a meaningful gesture but had also thought through the practical aspects of implementing it. This kind of systematic thinking, combined with genuine compassion, suggested that he was developing the qualities that would make him an effective future monarch. "I think this is an excellent idea," the Queen said finally. "Would you like to write the first letter yourself?" Prince George's face lit up with excitement and nervousness in equal measure. "Could I? Would that be appropriate?" "I think it would be very appropriate," the Queen replied. "I think it would be more meaningful coming from you than from anyone else. You're the one who recognized the need for such a gesture." That evening, Prince George sat at his desk with a blank piece of writing paper before him, struggling to find the right words to express what he wanted to say. He had written many formal letters and thank-you notes as part of his education, but this felt different. This was personal, a genuine expression of gratitude and concern for someone he had met only briefly, but who had made a lasting impression on him. He began several drafts, each time becoming frustrated with the formal language that seemed to distance him from the sincerity he wanted to convey. Finally, he decided to write in his own voice, using the simple, direct language that felt most natural to him. The letter he eventually produced was not long, but it was heartfelt. He thanked William for his years of service and acknowledged the sacrifice that his departure represented. More importantly, he expressed his hope that William would find fulfillment in his new path and included a personal invitation to return to the castle whenever he wished, not as a guard, but as an honored guest. When Professor Davidson reviewed the letter the next day, he was struck by its sincerity and appropriateness. It maintained the dignity required of royal correspondence, while conveying genuine warmth and personal concern. Most remarkably, it demonstrated that Prince George was beginning to understand the human dimension of leadership, the importance of recognizing and valuing the individuals who made institutional service possible. The letter was carefully prepared on official stationery and sealed with the royal seal. Captain Morrison, who had been briefed on the initiative, arranged for it to be delivered to William's home address, along with a small token of appreciation, a framed photograph of the castle guard in which William could be seen at his post, a tangible reminder of his years of faithful service. Unknown to Prince George, his simple gesture was about to set in motion a series of events that would have far-reaching consequences. The letter would arrive at a moment when William was struggling most with his transition to civilian life, feeling isolated and questioning the value of his years in service. What seemed like a small act of kindness from a 10-year-old prince would prove to be exactly the validation and encouragement that William needed to rediscover his sense of purpose and direction. As Prince George went about his regular activities in the days following the letter's dispatch, he felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond the completion of a task. He had taken his first real step as a future leader, identifying a need and responding to it with both compassion and practical action. The experience had taught him that leadership was not just about grand gestures and formal ceremonies, but about noticing the individuals who made service possible and ensuring that their contributions were acknowledged and valued. The letter was making its way through the postal system, carrying with it the potential to transform not just William's perspective on his recent departure from royal service, but also his entire understanding of his relationship with the royal family he had served so faithfully. When it arrived, it would demonstrate that his years of quiet dedication had been noticed and appreciated by those who mattered most, and that his service had made a lasting impression on the future King of England. The morning rain tapped steadily against the windows of William Hayes's modest flat as he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the pile of bills that seemed to grow larger each week. His new position in private security was providing the income he needed, but the work felt increasingly meaningless. Each day blended into the next in a monotonous routine of checking credentials and monitoring security cameras, a far cry from the purposeful dignity of his years as a royal guard. Emma, now 15, had been trying to lift his spirits with her characteristic teenage optimism, but William could see the concern in her eyes. She had watched her father transform from a man who carried himself with quiet pride to someone who seemed to have lost his connection to everything that had once given his life meaning. The loss of her mother had been devastating for both of them, but watching her father struggle with his new reality was adding another layer of heartache to her young life. The doorbell rang just as William was preparing to leave for another soul-crushing day at the corporate office he was assigned to guard. He almost ignored it, assuming it was another delivery, or perhaps a neighbor. But something made him pause and answer the door. Standing on his doorstep was a uniformed postal worker, holding an envelope that bore the unmistakable seal of the royal household. William's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the envelope, his mind racing through possibilities of what official business might require his attention weeks after his departure from service. Perhaps there was some final paperwork to complete, or maybe an issue with his pension arrangements. He had been dreading any contact from his former life, afraid that it would only intensify the pain of what he had lost. After the postal worker departed, William stood in his hallway holding the envelope, reluctant to open it and confront whatever official matter it contained. Emma, who had been preparing for school, noticed his hesitation and approached with curious concern. "What is it, Dad?" she asked, noting the royal seal that even a teenager could recognize. "Something from the palace," William replied, his voice betraying uncertainty and apprehension. "Well, open it," Emma said with the practical directness that reminded him so much of her mother. "Whatever it is, standing here worrying about it won't change what's inside." Taking his daughter's advice, William carefully opened the envelope and withdrew its contents. What he found was not the official correspondence he had expected, but rather a personal letter written in the careful handwriting of a young person. As his eyes moved across the page, reading the thoughtful words of Prince George, William felt something inside his chest begin to loosen and warm. The letter was everything that formal royal correspondence typically was not. Personal, heartfelt, and genuine. Prince George had written about their brief conversation and how it had stayed with him. He expressed gratitude for William's years of service and acknowledged the difficulty of the decision William had been forced to make. Most remarkably, the young prince had written about his own growing understanding of what service meant and how much he valued those who dedicated their lives to protecting and serving his family. Emma watched her father's expression transform as he read, seeing emotions play across his features that she hadn't witnessed in months. When William finished reading, he handed the letter to her with tears in his eyes, unable to speak for several moments. As Emma read Prince George's words, she began to understand something that had been puzzling her for weeks. Her father hadn't just left a job when he resigned from the Queen's Guard. He had walked away from an identity that had defined him for over 2 decades. The letter in her hands proved that his years of service had mattered, that he had been seen and appreciated by the very people he had protected. "Dad," Emma said softly, "this is incredible. Do you understand what this means?" William nodded slowly, still processing the emotional impact of receiving such personal recognition from a member of the royal family. "It means that it wasn't just a job," he said quietly. "It means that the years I gave mattered to them." The letter had an immediate effect on William's demeanor and outlook. As he went to work that day, he carried himself differently, with something approaching the dignity that had once been his natural bearing. The knowledge that his service had been meaningful enough to prompt a personal letter from the future king gave him a new perspective on his current circumstances. Over the following days, William found himself returning to the letter repeatedly, reading Prince George's words and reflecting on their conversation at the castle. The prince's genuine interest and evident maturity had impressed him during their brief meeting, but the letter revealed an even deeper level of thoughtfulness and compassion than William had initially recognized. More importantly, the letter sparked something in William that had been dormant since his departure from royal service. A sense of purpose and possibility. Prince George had written about his hope that William would find fulfillment in his new path, and those words began to germinate in William's mind like seeds planted in fertile soil. 2 weeks after receiving the letter, William made a decision that surprised even himself. He arranged to take a day off from his security job and traveled to London to visit a military charity that supported veterans transitioning to civilian life. He had heard about the organization during his final weeks of service but had been too proud and overwhelmed to seek their assistance. The charity's offices were located in a modest building near Victoria Station, staffed by a combination of former military personnel and civilian volunteers who understood the unique challenges faced by those leaving armed services. When William explained his situation to the intake coordinator, a former sergeant named Marcus Thompson, he found himself speaking with someone who truly understood his struggles. "The identity crisis is the hardest part," Marcus explained as they sat in a small conference room. "You've spent decades knowing exactly who you are and what your purpose is. Suddenly, you're in civilian clothes, and everything feels different." William nodded, feeling validated in a way he hadn't experienced since leaving his position. "I thought I was being practical, making the right choice for my family's future. But I feel like I've lost myself in the process." Marcus smiled knowingly. "The good news is that the skills and values that made you a good guard don't disappear just because you change uniforms. The question is finding a way to use them in a new context." Over the next several hours, William participated in a comprehensive assessment designed to identify his transferable skills and explore career options that might provide both financial stability and personal satisfaction. The process revealed possibilities he had never considered. Working with other veterans, contributing to security training programs, or even pursuing education that could open new professional doors. More significantly, the conversation helped William understand that his struggle wasn't a sign of weakness or failure, but rather a natural part of transitioning from a highly structured military environment to the relative freedom and uncertainty of civilian life. Many successful veterans had faced similar challenges and found ways to build meaningful new careers. As William rode the train back home that evening, he found himself thinking about Prince George's letter in a new light. The young prince had written about finding fulfillment in a new path, and William was beginning to see that such fulfillment might indeed be possible with the right approach and support. That night, William sat down at his kitchen table and did something he hadn't done since leaving royal service. He began planning for the future. Using the materials provided by the charity, he started mapping out steps toward a career that would allow him to use his experience and skills in service to other veterans. The work would be meaningful, the pay reasonable, and most importantly, it would allow him to maintain the sense of purpose that had always driven him. Emma noticed the change in her father immediately. The man who had been drifting through his days with resigned acceptance was suddenly animated with new possibilities. When William explained his plans to her, she saw a spark in his eyes that had been missing for months. "You know, Dad," Emma said as they discussed his ideas over dinner, "I think that Prince saw something in you that you forgot about yourself." William considered his daughter's observation and realized she was absolutely right. Prince George's letter had served as a mirror, reflecting back to William his own worth and the value of his experience. The young prince's recognition had given him permission to see himself as something more than a former guard struggling to adapt to civilian life. 3 months later, William began his new position as a counselor with the same charity that had helped him. His role involved working with military veterans who were facing similar transitions, using his own experience and understanding to guide them through their challenges. It was work that felt meaningful and important. Work that honored his years of service while building toward a future that felt both stable and purposeful. The transformation in William's life had ripple effects that extended beyond his personal circumstances. Emma watched her father regain his sense of dignity and purpose, and the confidence that returned to him gradually healed some of the wounds left by her mother's death and the difficult period that followed. Their relationship deepened as William became more present and engaged, no longer weighed down by the regret and uncertainty that had consumed him. 6 months after receiving Prince George's letter, William made a decision that felt both natural and necessary. He wrote his own letter to the young prince, sharing how the thoughtful gesture had affected his life and describing the new path he had found. William wanted Prince George to know that his kindness had made a real difference, that leadership could indeed start with small acts of compassion and recognition. The letter William wrote was carefully crafted, maintaining appropriate respect while conveying genuine gratitude. He described how Prince George's words had arrived at exactly the right moment, providing encouragement and validation when he needed them most. He explained how that encouragement had given him the confidence to seek help and explore new possibilities for his future. More importantly, William wanted the young prince to understand that his instinct to reach out to someone in transition had been profoundly meaningful. In his letter, William wrote about the importance of leaders who notice and value the individuals who make their positions possible, suggesting that Prince George was already demonstrating the kind of thoughtful leadership that would serve him well in his future role. When Prince George received William's letter several weeks later, he was both surprised and deeply moved by its contents. He had written his original letter as a simple gesture of thanks, never imagining that it would have such a significant impact on someone's life. Reading about William's transformation and new career filled him with a sense of pride and understanding about the potential power of personal connection and recognition. The experience taught Prince George an important lesson about leadership that no formal education could have provided. He learned that the most meaningful gestures were often the smallest ones, that taking time to acknowledge and value individuals could have effects far beyond what might be immediately apparent. The exchange of letters had shown him that leadership was not just about grand ceremonies and official duties, but about recognizing the humanity in others and responding to it with compassion and respect. Years later, as Prince George continued to grow into his role as a future monarch, he would carry with him the memory of his interaction with William Hayes. The lesson he learned from that experience would influence his approach to leadership in countless small ways, reminding him always to look beyond titles and uniforms to see the individuals who dedicated their lives to service. For William, the letter from Prince George had been more than just a thoughtful gesture. It had been a lifeline thrown at exactly the moment when he needed it most. It had reminded him of his worth, validated his years of service, and given him the confidence to seek help and build a new future. The subtle move of a 10-year-old prince had indeed had a massive impact, transforming not just one man's life, but rippling outward to affect his daughter, the veterans he would eventually counsel, and the understanding of leadership that would guide a future king. The story of Prince George and the Resigning Guard became a quiet legend within the walls of Windsor Castle, passed down among staff members as an example of the kind of thoughtful leadership that made service to the royal family meaningful. It demonstrated that true leadership could begin at any age, with any gesture, as long as it came from a place of genuine care and recognition for the value of every individual who contributed to something larger than themselves.